You know what finally broke me? I had this white oak tabletop, 8 boards I'd spent 2 weekends jointing and gluing up, and I was proud of it. Beautiful figure, tight seams, looked like a single slab. And then, about 4 months later, I walked into the shop, and there it was, a crack running almost the full length of the 3rd board from the edge, not along the glue line, right through the board itself. The grain had run off the face about halfway down, and that's exactly where it split. I'd done everything right by modern standards. I'd acclimated the lumber. I'd sealed the end grain. I'd used proper cauls. And the wood still failed, because the way it was cut at the mill had severed the very fibers that were supposed to hold it together. Now, around that same time, I happened to be reading about Viking shipbuilding. Not because I was looking for answers to my cracked tabletop, just out of curiosity. And I came across something that stopped me cold. The Norse shipwrights who built those longships, the ones that crossed the North Atlantic in open water, never sawed their hull planks. Not once. They split them. They drove wedges into a log and let the wood come apart along its own grain, so that every single fiber ran unbroken from one end of the plank to the other. And those planks, some of them barely an inch thick, survived voyages that would tear apart most modern boats. That sent me down a path I'm still on today, and what I've learned about riving, which is what this splitting method is called, has genuinely changed the way I think about wood. So today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how the Vikings produced planks, why their method creates stronger, more flexible, more water-resistant lumber than anything that comes off a modern sawmill, and how you can start applying this in your own shop, even if you've never split a log in your life. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll show you a simple way to read the end grain of any log and predict exactly how it's going to split before you ever drive the first wedge. Let's get into it. Riving is arguably the oldest method of producing flat stock from a round log, and for most of human history, it was the only method. Before powered sawmills, before pit saws, before any kind of mechanical cutting, craftsmen all over the world produced their lumber by splitting. But nobody refined the technique quite like the Norse shipwrights, because nobody else was staking their lives on the result quite the way they were. And what's remarkable is how relevant their approach still is for anyone working wood by hand today. So let me give you some context, because understanding who these people were and what they were building makes the technique land a whole lot harder. The Norse shipbuilding tradition stretches back well over 1,000 years. We're talking roughly the 8th century through the 11th century as the peak era, though the methods are older than that. These were the people who built the longships and knars that sailed from Scandinavia to Iceland, to Greenland, and all the way to the coast of North America 500 years before Columbus. And they did it in open boats with no deck, in some of the most violent waters on Earth. Now, here's what matters for us as woodworkers. When you're building a vessel that has to flex with North Atlantic swells rather than resist them rigidly, your planking has to be thin, light, strong, and able to bend without cracking. You cannot achieve that with sawn lumber. The Norse shipwrights understood this at a material level that most modern woodworkers have never had to think about. Every plank in a Viking hull was riven from a straight-grained oak log, split radially outward from the center, so the grain followed the full length of the plank without interruption. We have physical proof this works. The Oseberg ship, excavated from a burial mound in Norway in 1904, was built around 820 AD. When archaeologists examined the hull planks, the wood fibers were continuous from end to end. The Gokstad ship, built around 890 AD, had hull strakes less than 1 inch thick that had survived actual ocean voyages. These planks were over 1,000 years old and still structurally coherent, not because of some magical preservation, but because the grain had never been severed in the first place. There's a concept that runs through the old Norse approach to timber that I think captures the whole philosophy in a single idea. They didn't think of a plank as something you cut out of a log. They thought of it as something that already existed inside the log, waiting to be released. Your job wasn't to impose a shape on the wood. Your job was to understand the wood's internal structure and let it come apart where it naturally wanted to. That's not poetry. That's engineering. And once you see it in action, you never look at a log the same way again. All right, let's start with the most important thing to understand, which is what actually happens inside the wood when you saw a board versus when you split one. When a sawmill cuts a plank, the blade follows a straight line. It doesn't care where the grain goes. It cuts a flat plane through the log, regardless of how the fibers twist, wander, or curve inside. And in almost every board you've ever bought, the grain does wander. It curves around knots. It spirals slightly over the length of the trunk. It shifts direction near the pith. The saw cuts right through all of that, severing fibers wherever they don't happen to line up with the blade's path. That severed grain is called runout, and it's the source of almost every structural failure you've ever had in a sawn board. When grain runs off the face of a board, that's where it cracks. That's where it cups. That's where moisture gets in. That's where it breaks under load. You've seen this 100 times and probably blamed the wood or blamed yourself. But the real problem happened at the mill, when a straight blade cut through curved grain. Now think about what happens when you split a log with a wedge. The wedge doesn't follow a straight line. It follows the path of least resistance, which is the natural cleavage plane between the wood fibers. The split travels along the grain, not across it. Every single fiber on both sides of the split remains continuous and intact from one end to the other. There is zero runout, zero severed fibers, zero weak points created by the separation process. If you were to take a straight-grained oak billet about 16 inches long and split it with a froe, then take an identical billet and rip it on a table saw, you'd see the difference immediately. Pick up the riven piece and look at the face. The grain lines flow across the surface like water, unbroken, following gentle curves that reflect the tree's actual growth. Now, pick up the sawn piece. You'll see grain lines that start on the face and then dive off the edge partway down the board. Those are severed fibers, and each one is a future crack, a future cup, a future failure. That single difference, continuous grain versus severed grain, is the reason everything else I'm about to tell you works the way it does. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now, let me walk you through how the Vikings actually split a log into planks, because the process itself is beautifully logical once you see it. It starts with log selection, which I'll cover in detail in a moment, but assume for now you've got a straight-grained oak log, maybe 18 to 24 inches in diameter and 6 to 8 feet long. The bark is off, and you're looking at a clean cross-section on the end. The fundamental rule of riving is this: always split in half. You never try to peel a thin plank off the side of a thick log. That's how you lose control of the split. Instead, you take the whole log and split it right down the middle into two halves. Then you take each half and split that in half. Then each quarter gets split in half again. You keep halving until you reach plank thickness. On a 20-inch diameter log, you might get 8 to 12 usable planks this way, depending on how thin you want them. The first split on a full log is done with iron wedges and a heavy maul or sledge. You read the end grain, find the center, and drive your first wedge across the diameter. Then, you set a second wedge a few inches ahead of the crack, and a third a few inches ahead of that. You're walking the split down the length of the log, and the wood is separating along its own grain the entire way. You can hear it. It makes a sound, almost like tearing heavy fabric, and it's one of the most satisfying sounds in woodworking. Once you're down to quarter sections, you can switch to a froe and a froe club for the remaining splits. A froe is a simple L-shaped tool, basically a blade set at a right angle to a handle, and you drive it into the end grain with a club and then lever it sideways to steer the split. This steering is the real skill. If the split starts running off to one side, making one half thicker than the other, you apply leverage toward the thick side. The thicker half is stiffer and resists bending, so the crack redirects toward it. It takes practice, but even a beginner can get usable planks within a few attempts. The beauty of this process is that you're not imposing anything on the wood. You're simply asking it to come apart where it wants to, and then gently guiding the separation to keep it even. Now, before you even think about splitting, you need the right log, and this is where the Vikings were more selective than most modern woodworkers would ever think to be. They understood that riving only works well with certain species and certain logs within those species. The gold standard is white oak, Quercus alba. It has long, straight fibers, prominent medullary rays that act as natural cleavage planes on the radial faces, and it grows with relatively little spiral grain in a good specimen. Red oak rives well too, though it's more porous and less water-resistant. Ash is excellent for riving, with its long, flexible fibers, which is why it was the traditional choice for tool handles, oar shafts, and spear shafts across northern Europe. Chestnut splits beautifully, so does western red cedar, which many indigenous cultures along the Pacific Northwest rived into planks for longhouses. What doesn't rive well? Elm is almost impossible to split cleanly because its fibers interlock. That's why elm was historically used for wheel hubs and chopping blocks, applications where you want the wood to resist splitting. Sycamore has interlocked grain. Most tropical hardwoods are too dense or too irregular in their fiber structure to rive predictably. When you're evaluating a log for riving, you want a straight trunk with minimal taper, no visible spiral in the bark pattern, and as few branches as possible in the section you plan to split. Every branch creates a knot, and every knot is a point where the grain dives inward and disrupts the cleavage plane. The Norse shipwrights would sometimes select trees years in advance, choosing young oaks that were growing straight and tall in dense forest, where competition for light forced them upward with minimal side branching. Look at the end grain. You want to see growth rings that are relatively even in spacing and rays that run straight from the pith to the bark without significant wavering. If the rings are wildly uneven, the tree grew unevenly, and the grain inside will wander. Once I understood all of this, the next question was obvious. Why is a riven plank actually better than a sawn one? I mean, I understood the grain continuity argument, but how much difference does it really make? The answer is, it makes an enormous difference, and it shows up in three specific ways: strength, flexibility, and water resistance. First, strength. When every fiber in a plank runs unbroken from end to end, the tensile strength along the length is dramatically higher than in a sawn board of the same species and dimensions. A sawn oak board might have grain running off the face at a 5 or 10 degree angle over its length, and that runout can reduce bending strength by 30 to 50% compared to perfectly straight grain. A riven plank has zero runout by definition. This is why the Vikings could use 1-inch thick hull planks, where a modern boat builder using sawn lumber would need 1.5 inches or more for the same structural integrity. Second, flexibility. This is the one that really surprised me. A riven plank bends more readily along its length without cracking, precisely because there are no severed fibers acting as stress risers. Think about bending a bundle of uncooked spaghetti versus bending the same number of noodles that have been scored halfway through at random intervals. The intact bundle flexes smoothly. The scored noodles snap. That's the difference between riven and sawn lumber under bending load. Viking hulls were designed to flex with ocean swells, hogging and sagging over wave crests, and riven planks made that possible without structural failure. Third, water resistance. This one's counterintuitive until you think about it at the cellular level. When a saw cuts through wood fibers, it opens up the cell walls, exposing the hollow interior of each cell to the surface. Moisture wicks right into those open cells, but when you split wood, the fibers separate between cells, leaving the cell walls intact and closed. Water hits the surface and sheds off rather than soaking in. This is why riven oak shingles last 50 to 70 years on a roof, while sawn shingles might last 20. Same species, same tree, completely different performance, all because of how the plank was produced. For modern applications, this means riven stock is ideal for anything that lives outdoors. Garden gates, fence boards, outdoor furniture, tool handles that will get wet, mallet heads, shingles and shakes, workbench tops where you want maximum resistance to seasonal movement. Even if you only rive stock occasionally for specific projects, knowing when and why to do it gives you an enormous advantage. Now, once you've riven a plank, it comes off the log rough. The surface follows the grain's natural undulation, so it's not perfectly flat the way a sawn board is. And that's actually fine. The Vikings dressed their planks with axes and draw knives, working the surface down to final thickness, while following the grain's natural contour. A broad axe or side axe was the primary tool for this. You'd secure the riven plank on a low beam or trestle and hew across the surface with controlled angled blows, removing thin chips and bringing the plank toward uniform thickness. A draw knife on a shaving horse handled the finer work, especially on thinner stock. And here's the beautiful part. Because the grain in a riven board never reverses direction the way it does in sawn lumber, planing and draw knife work is almost effortless. You never hit that moment where the tool suddenly digs in because the grain switched on you. It all flows one way. Every stroke is clean. The finished surface isn't perfectly uniform in thickness, and that's not a flaw. It's a feature. The plank is thicker where the grain naturally produced more material and thinner where it didn't, and that variation means the wood is under less internal stress than a board that's been forced to a uniform dimension by a planer. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is treating the lumberyard as your starting point. Most of us walk into a hardwood dealer, pick boards that look good, and bring them home. We never question how those boards were produced, but every one of those boards was sawn, which means everyone has some degree of grain runout, some amount of severed fiber, some built-in tendency to move in ways we don't want. Once you understand riving, you realize the lumberyard is giving you a compromised product, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because sawing is inherently a compromise between efficiency and grain integrity. The second pattern is fighting warp and twist with clamps, cauls, and glue, rather than starting with stock that doesn't want to move. I spent years flattening twisted boards with hand planes, gluing up panels with cauls to force everything flat, and relying on breadboard ends to keep tabletops from cupping. Most of that effort was compensating for grain runout in sawn lumber. A riven board from a well-selected log barely moves at all, because the grain is continuous and balanced on both faces. The third pattern is choosing wood by appearance rather than grain structure. We pick boards based on figure, color, and width. But the old tradition picks logs based on how they'll split, which tells you everything about the internal grain structure. A log that splits clean and straight has grain that will behave for the rest of its life. Appearance is secondary to structure. The fourth pattern is treating uniform thickness as the only mark of quality. We run everything through the planer until it's dead flat and perfectly consistent, which often means removing material that was carrying structural grain and introducing stress by forcing the wood into a shape it doesn't naturally want to hold. The Norse approach lets the wood keep its natural thickness variation and works with it instead of against it. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You don't have to abandon sawn lumber entirely, but knowing when to reeve and why gives you a choice you didn't have before. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning, this is a way to read any log and predict how it's going to split before you commit. Take a hatchet or a small hand axe and go to the end of the log. Find a spot near the bark, on the end grain, where the growth rings look straight and evenly spaced. Set the hatchet edge radially, pointing from the bark toward the center of the log, and give it one firm tap. Just enough to start a small crack, maybe 2 or 3 inches long. Now, look at that crack. Does it run straight along the radius? That's a log that will rive clean. Does it immediately wander sideways or curve? That tells you the grain is spiraling or interlocked, and this log is going to fight you. Do this test in 3 or 4 spots around the circumference. If they all split straight, you've got a winner. If even one wanders badly, think twice. I started doing this about 3 years ago, and it has saved me from wrestling with uncooperative logs more times than I can count. It takes 30 seconds and tells you more about a log's internal structure than any visual inspection of the outside ever could. The old-timers didn't have moisture meters or board feet calculators. They had a hatchet and 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how trees grow. And honestly, the hatchet test tells you more than most of our modern tools do. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries, the kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now, or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. I want to leave you with the idea that changed everything for me, because it's bigger than any single technique. For my entire woodworking life, I thought my job was to cut wood into shape, to take a raw log or a rough board and remove material until it became what I wanted it to be. Sawing, planing, jointing, dimensioning, all of it was about imposing my will on the material. The Viking shipwrights had it backwards, or maybe they had it right. They believed the plank already existed inside the tree. The grain had already formed it. The fibers had already laid it out. The craftsman's job was simply to understand that internal structure well enough to release it without breaking it. That's not a minor difference in technique. That's a completely different relationship with the material. Try it once. Find a straight-grained oak or ash log. Even a short piece of firewood will do. Get a froe or a hatchet and a couple of wedges. And instead of cutting that log into boards, split it. Let the wood show you where the planks are. I think you'll be surprised at what you find. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.